because, all right, so the next example I wanted to go over, and I'm not going to finish this example because this is a homework problem. Now, this program does trip some students up. It's 4.9. I'm going to go ahead and read the description. Using the die class defined in this chapter, write a class called pair of dice, composed of 2 die objects. Include methods to get and set the individual die values, a method to roll the dice, and a method that returns the current sum of the 2 die values. Create a driver class called rolling the dice 2 to instantiate and use the pair of dice object. So let's use the whiteboard to think about how we're going to tackle this program. Okay, so here's what I have so far. Over here is where I'm going to write out my instance data and the name of my methods, like what methods I'm going to use. Over here is where I'm going to visualize how I interact with a pair of dice. And over here is where I'm going to think about my encapsulation and my services I'm going to provide and what my instance data I'm going to keep encapsulated. So the instructions actually give you a lot of information. It actually tells you that your instance data is going to be 2 die objects. So we can go ahead and write that down. So a lot of students get this confused because they try to use integers for die 1 and die 2, but the instructions specifically tell us to use a die object. So we're actually going to use the class that we created previously. So here's the class I created for die. It has instance data for face value, it has a getter, it has a setter, it has a roll method, and a toString. So essentially what our pair of dice object is going to do is manage 2 die objects. So since we know the pair of dice is actually managing 2 die objects, I'm going to update what my encapsulation looks like. So my pair of dice is actually encapsulating 2 die objects, and those 2 die objects has their own encapsulation. It's encapsulating the face value. And the services the die object provides is a get, the set, and the roll. So both of these 2 die objects are in memory and they provide their own get, set, and roll methods. So if you read the instructions from the book, it tells us what methods it wants us to create. It wants us to create getters and setters, a roll method, and a sum, but those are actually acting on 2 pairs of dice. I'm going to go ahead and write those methods out. All right, so here are the methods I created as described from the book. It wants us to actually make a getter and a setter. Now, it's important to kind of keep in mind that we're not actually taking in a die object and returning a die object. We're actually returning integer values for the face value. So the get value 1 is going to return an int, and so is get value 2. The set value 1 and the set value 2 is going to take in an int. We do have a roll method on the pair of dice. Now what the roll method is actually going to do is it's going to invoke the roll methods on die 1 and die 2. So when you invoke roll, it's going to basically roll die 1 and 2. So for instance, if you call roll on your pair of dice, the roll is going to roll die 1 and die 2 by invoking those methods on die 1 and 2. Then we have our sum method. The sum method is simply going to return the sum of face value 1 and face value 2. And the last thing we need is a toString method. I didn't add it. So the interfaces we're going to have on the pair of dice is the roll, the sum, the get value 1. So get value 1 is going to just interact with your die 1 object. Your set value 1, that's going to interact with the die 1 object. Your get value 2, that's going to interact with the die 2 object and the set value 2. Now the way the pair of dice work is we're basically considering these 2 die objects as one. So even though we can roll, get, set each die individually, we're grouping these 2 together as one object. So now whenever we roll, we're not just rolling one die, we're rolling both of the die. Whenever we get face value of 1, we're just looking at the face value of 1. Whenever we get the face value 2, we're just looking at the face value 2. Whenever we set value 1, we're simply just picking up die 1 and setting its face value. Same thing for die 2. So the idea behind this is you're basically pairing up these 2 die and you're managing them as one object. So let's go ahead and write this class. All right, so like I've been doing before, I made code comments of where I'm going to put my lines of code. So I put a code comment for where my instance data is going to go, where my constructor is going to go, my getters, my setters, other methods, which is going to be the roll and the sum, and my overrides, which is going to be the toString method. So I'm going to go ahead and create my instance data. Now here's my instance data. Now notice that my instance data is die object reference variables. So this pair of dice class is essentially using object reference variables for this die class over here. So before I do anything else, I'm going to go ahead and create my toString method because I want to go ahead and test this early because I'm not going to finish all this for you, but I do want to start testing this right away. Okay, so here's my toString. Now, all I'm doing is I'm just printing out my instance data, which is die 1 and 2. I use %s. These 2 are die object reference variables. Now, if I use %s, what I was going to do is invoke the toString method of the die object reference variable. So I'm going to go ahead and hop over to my test class and start testing this. So here's my test class. It's called rolling dice 2. I instantiate an instance of my pair of dice, and I simply just send that object to the system.out line. This is going to invoke the toString method. Here's my toString method. My toString method of my pair of dice is going to invoke the toString of each die object. So I'm going to go ahead and compile and run. And here's my output. If you notice on my toString method, I am using new lines because I'm trying to print out the information for die 1 on one line and die 2 on the next line. and this is the result. Now the reason why I did this first is because I want to show you that the result of die1 and die2 is null. Null means that the object reference variable was declared, but it's not pointing anywhere. So I have die1 and die2 declared to hold die objects, but these two objects have never been instantiated. So that means they're not actually in memory. And Java declared these variables to hold a die object, but there's no die object that it's holding or pointing to. So what I need to do is in my constructor, instantiate two die objects. So I'm going to go ahead and create my constructor. So here's my pair of dice constructor. Inside of my pair of dice constructor, I'm instantiating two die objects. So similar to what I did for other classes, I initialize my values inside of my constructor. Here, I'm initializing my values by instantiating two die objects and making sure that die1 and die2 object reference variables are actually pointing to a die object in memory. So now what I need to do is make my getters and setters. I'm not going to complete this. I'm going to just do it for one. All right, so here's my getters and my setters. So whenever I get the value 1, I'm essentially just invoking die1.getFaceValue and returning that value. GetFaceValue returns an integer. If I look at my die class, you can see that my GetFaceValue in my die class returns an integer. And then my setFaceValue, I'm accepting in an integer and passing that integer to my setFaceValue. So if you look at my die class, the setFaceValue accepts an integer and attempts to use that value for a face value. But I do have a filter here, so if the value is outside of the range of 1 through 6, the value will not be set. So if you look back at what I drew in my drawing for a pair of dice, whenever I call a getter or a setter, those getters and setters are essentially just working on the associated die object. So get value 1 is going to work on die 1 and set value 1 is going to work on die 1. So now what I want to do is test my getter and setter. So to test my getters and setters, I went ahead and invoked set value 1. I passed in a 4. I'm printing out that value using the getter. And then I'm trying to go outside of the range of a die by using negative 400 in my setter. And then I'm going to print out the value. I'm going to go ahead and compile and run. And here are my results. Now notice up here, this is where my toString method is. Before it said null, but now it's not saying null anymore because in my constructor, I instantiated those objects. So now it's actually reading the toString because those values are in memory. And then right here is where I call my setter. So I set the face value to 4. And then I attempted to set the value to negative 400, but that value did not take. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and set up the other methods, the roll and the sum. So here are the methods. I did not finish them for you, but they're pretty simple. The roll method is simply going to roll each die. So you're going to invoke roll on die 1 and die 2. That's going to randomize the face values for each of those die. For the sum, you need to get the face value for die 1 and 2 and add those two values together and then return that value. This method does return an integer, so you need to have a return statement here that returns an integer. Now, if I compile this right now, it's not going to compile because I don't have a return statement. And that's exactly what Java's telling me. I'm missing a return statement. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and just add a return statement so that this will compile. I put a -1, but I'm putting -1 because -1 does not make any sense. So if you try to use this program the way it is, you'll realize that sum is not working. But that way this will compile and my driver class will compile and run. So go ahead and finish this. So this is actually a homework problem. Students always have a difficult time with this because they get confused on what they're actually using for the instance data. And they also get confused on instantiating your die objects inside of your constructor. But using the whiteboard to plan out what our die class is going to look like should have helped us. You should do this for all of your blueprint classes. Like think about how you interact with those objects, what methods they're going to have, what your instance data is going to be, and make a list of what you need to add and then follow that list whenever you create your blueprint class.